NBA free agency used to be the peak of the offseason. There was always a ton of news. We'd have all NBA players switching teams. We'd be talking about max cap space. This guy would get way too much money. This guy would be on a great deal. And now the biggest news we get is Miles Turner and Dorian Finney-Smith. Obviously, something has changed here with NBA free agency. It's just not as prevalent. It's not as big of a deal. And I'm going to tell you exactly why that is the case. There's a couple of different reasons. A couple of different things have changed over the years. And this offseason specifically being very quiet for free agency, there's a lot of reasons for that. First and foremost, the thing that everybody is going to be talking about, the new CBA, the second apron, all of the different rules that the league has implemented over the last couple of seasons have definitely restricted free agency spending. There's no doubt about it. There's obviously a connection between having big time free agency summers like 2019, where you've got Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant changing teams, you've got Kawhi changing teams, and then all of a sudden Paul George is getting traded for. That was probably the peak of crazy free agency, but there's obviously a difference, a line in the sand between 2019 and now, and one of the biggest differences, of course, is the new CBA. Without getting into all of the small details of it, teams do not want to spend as much money now as they used to, because before, under the old CBA, the only punishment for spending a lot of money on your team, for having a really high payroll, was having to spend more money, both on your team itself as well as paying for going over the luxury tax and all these other lines. The owners just had to write a bigger check. So there was really no excuse for them to not pay a ton of money if their team was really good. The Boston Celtics this offseason are a perfect example. Under the old CBA, that was a team you could have just spent a ton of money for, been way into the luxury tax for, and it would have been totally fine. With this new set of rules, there are actual roster building restrictions put into place when you spend too much money. And that, of course, has carryover towards free agency, where teams are not as willing to take on a bunch of money. They're much more frugal about their contracts. And overall, that just lowers the market value of players on the open market. And we get less of these big time deals. And we get an offseason in which the biggest free agency news was Miles Turner going to Milwaukee and Dorian Finney-Smith going to Houston. Speaking of new rules, one of the other major things that's happening here as well is there's definitely been some restrictions on teams basically cheating. Tampering is a big word you see out there around the NBA when it comes to free agency and trades, and it definitely seems like the league has cracked down on teams having conversations with free agents before free agency actually starts, because typically when free agency starts at like 6 o'clock in the evening Eastern time, at 6:01 we've got this flood of information coming in about all these deals, and this year that wasn't the case. We got news on a Jaren Jackson extension and then not a whole lot else for a little while, and it definitely slowed down the pace of free agency. We don't have all these deals at the very beginning of free agency, but there's also things happening in this particular offseason specifically that really limited the market. The main thing, of course, is that teams didn't have money to spend. In this new environment with the new CBA, teams have been, and players have been, more excited about signing extensions rather than going out in the market and finding out what they'd be worth in free agency. We'll talk about extensions in a second, but that results in not a lot of teams having significant cap space at all. We came into the offseason and the Nets were the only team with max contract space, and they were also the only team with really any cap space at all. So when there's no spending power out there, players are not going to want to go to free agency in the first place. And of course, you're not going to see guys signing for $30 million a year because there's just no teams out there that can pay them. The salary cap system of the league definitely restricts free agency possibilities when teams aren't planning for a big offseason. And this was just not an offseason in which teams were planning on a bunch of free agents being available and thus a bunch of cap space being available. In a different offseason in which 6 or 7 teams had $20 to $30 million in salary cap space, we would have seen much more movement. We would have seen a lot more deals. Even in this new CBA, that just wasn't the case for this particular offseason. And the reason for that are obvious, right? If there's no other cap space out there, it's hard to get into a bidding war and really raise the value of these players on the open market when there aren't any teams other than Brooklyn that can offer more than the $13 to $14 million full mid-level exception. And that's why you see guys like Dorian Finney-Smith signing for basically that number in free agency over multiple years, because that was really their only option if the Nets weren't going to sign them. And as I alluded to earlier, one of the main reasons why that was the case, why there wasn't cap space this offseason, is because players and teams are signing extensions more than they ever have before for a couple of different reasons. One, they're definitely concerned about their value. The players are concerned about their value on the open market because of the new CBA, because of the lack of spending power. They don't want to end up in a situation where they go to free agency and get less than they would have gotten on an extension with their incumbent team. They don't want to risk it. They don't want to go into the market and have the Nets be the only team with salary cap space. They don't want to go into the market and have all these contenders pinching pennies and not trying to go over the second apron and not willing to give them a bunch of money. And so they end up signing extensions before they ever even get to free agency, which leads to more trades and contracts getting moved. But when it comes to the actual free agency period, guys jumping from one team to the next, it's just not as much of an option because these teams and players are signing extensions. There's benefits to the team as well because they know they can probably get a below value contract signed for a player without them reaching free agency, because again, the players are going to be motivated to not reach free agency either. And those two factors coming together means that a lot of players are signing extensions and there's not as much cap space and there's just not as many big time players out there looking for big contracts that just don't exist. A perfect illustration of that is what is happening in the restricted free agency market right now. You've got Jonathan Kuminga, Josh Giddey, Cam Thomas. These are guys that typically would probably be worth somewhere in the $25 to $30 million range if there were a bunch of teams out there with cap space. If there were a bunch of teams that didn't have all these other guys locked up on long-term extensions, those three players specifically, whether it was their choice or otherwise, ended up going into restricted free agency, and there just aren't offers out there for them, and they're probably going to end up signing for less than what they are worth on the open market. One, because they're restricted free agents, but two, because the incumbent teams have all of the leverage because there's no money out there. And that scenario existed for unrestricted free agents as well, and they were extremely concerned about that possibility, about going into the market, not having any money out there for them really, and then not having any leverage. The restricted free agency aspect of that changes things a little bit for those players I mentioned specifically, but it's a good illustration of what exactly is happening here with the combination of all these factors together. Now, having said all those things, a large portion of these issues are directly related to this offseason in particular. The 2025 offseason was always going to be limited in terms of free agency because there just weren't teams out there with spending power. But in 2026 and in 2027, there is an expectation there's going to be a lot more salary cap space available around the league, and a bunch of big time players' contracts are going to be coming up in 26 and 27 and could possibly test the free agency market because they know there are teams that are preparing for guys like Nikola Jokic, guys like Luka Doncic to become free agents. Now, we could end up back in a summer 2025 scenario if a bunch of those guys sign extensions and a lot of that cap space goes away and those guys don't actually hit the open market. But if you're looking for a summer that looks something similar to what we saw in 2019, there's a real possibility that 26 or 27 would be that summer because a lot of the factors we've talked about in this video are directly related to the situation around this offseason specifically. The problem is, if you're looking for an offseason similar to 2019 or just more movement in general, the thing that isn't directly related to this offseason in particular is the new CBA, and that is here to stay, and that is definitely going to limit free agency, and in large part, that was kind of the intention of the rules that were put in. Part of the intention was to limit spending overall, frankly, to save the owners money, to give them an excuse to not have to spend a bunch of money on their payroll. But the trickle-down effect of that is that there isn't as much cap space available. Players and teams are signing extensions, and free agency itself isn't what it used to be. The concept of a summer of 2010 happening again, where you've got multiple All-NBA players jumping ship and going to a new team, or what happened in 2019 where multiple super teams were built basically overnight, that's just not really how the league works anymore. We saw it even with Kevin Durant this offseason, who could have waited for another year and gone into free agency, but the Suns were proactive enough to realize, hey, we got to go and trade him. We got to get value out of him. Now, teams are more proactive than ever about either signing their stars or their big names or even their above average players to extensions and or trading them before they hit free agency in general so that they maintain the value of that player on their roster rather than just losing them for nothing. It's possible that new rules are implemented into the future, into the next CBA, and then things change, but as it stands right now, NBA free agency just isn't the same as it used to be, and frankly, it's pretty intentional on the part of the league.